I'd been a hunter for most of my life leading up to this incident. The smell of the warm air and the beauty of nature always had me at ease. I never felt scared alone at night in the woods because I had seen everything there is to be scared of. I've seen bears the size of small cars, animals so vicious that they'll kill anything that moves. The one thing I was never scared of was deer. I'd heard the tales of skinwalkers and wendigos and pretty much anything in between. My uncle was an expert on tracking and hunting. We always went on trips together and would always come back with a fresh kill. He did have a rule, though. I remember it so vividly because it was weird. He never wanted to go hunting in winter. I never asked why. I don't know, but something about it always had me on edge. One day during winter, I was about to go deer hunting when my uncle stopped me at the front door. When he came in, he saw my packed supplies and my rifle and knew I was about to go hunting. He immediately burst into a wrath of anger and dragged me to the wall to get into my face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he said, spittle flying all over my face as he looked at me crazy. He looked primal, as if he was fearful of something that he didn't want to share. It's the same face you would expect a child to make if he was dumped in the middle of nowhere. The face of fear you see in people who have PTSD. I calmly brushed him off and got to the door saying I was going hunting. I was not about to fight with my uncle and ruin the trip, as I hadn't gone hunting for close to a month. When you hunt, you get adjusted to it, and when you go on break, you kind of miss it. As I got in my truck, my uncle peered at me out the window. He was there to take care of my house, but before I reversed, he left with the door open. My uncle's prone to outburst. As I should mention, he's only ever done it a few times, and it's always in a situation where the reaction suits it. Not this one, though. This one was bad, and I wondered what was so bad about hunting in the winter. The spot I'd planned was an isolated one. It was a very heavily forested area, which I hadn't been to before. I obviously had mapped the area out and brought essential survival tools in case the worst came, but I never thought I'd have to use it after all those years out in the woods. When I arrived, the crisp cold air immediately saturated me in discomfort. I quickly got another layer of clothes on before I started to walk to where I would set up camp for the night. The clearing I had chosen was a pretty tight one. There was a big tree in the center that stood tall above the rest. It was called the Forest Star, which suited it. Around the clearing, the forest was extremely dense. Almost no sun shone through the top. There was a small hunting tower north of the entrance of the clearing, so it was a direct walk from the camp. As I walked ahead, I noticed something. There were very small droplets of blood littering the ground. My first thought was that it must be from an injured animal or something, but the droplets were small and evenly placed. I shook the thought out of my head and made it to my setup as I started to pin my tent. When I was done, I checked my watch. It was about 5:30 p.m. I had about 2 hours for hunting before it was pitch black, so I made it to the tower. When I undid my rifle from the case, I heard scraping. Shaking it off, I took position and waited. As I stood there, time almost seemed to slow down. I was in a precise focus. I was ready for anything. I wasn't ready for what I saw, though. Out came two bucks that seemed injured. There were small droplets of blood coming from their eyes. As I focused in, I saw that it wasn't dried blood either. It was fresh, and it was oozing from their eyes. I was shocked. I'd never seen anything like it. Multiple scenarios ran through my head. Had a hunter shot both of them in the eye and managed not to kill them? But each scenario seemed more unlikely than the last. I took aim at the closest one and shot it. It stood there for a second, just not moving. Then they trotted off as if nothing had happened. Blood was running from the wound, so I'd obviously hit it, but it didn't seem scared or fazed. I decided that was enough and sort of jogged to my site. I was freaking out and decided that I'd cook dinner and go to bed early. When I got back to camp, I pulled out a tin of beans, grabbed a pot, and started a fire so I could cook them. As I cracked open a beer, the familiar sound of a branch snapping sounded off next to me. I brushed it off as I sat back to relax, thinking it was probably a small deer. I was thinking about the deer as I started to chalk it up to the fact that I must not have hit deep, and the deer was in shock. When I finished eating, I went to bed. I was shivering in the night cold, and I could hear my body shaking uncontrollably. As I dozed off after a brutal 2 hours of cold, I heard another snap. This time, it was a lot louder, though, like a bear. I immediately grabbed my rifle and got out of the tent. My fire was burning low, and in the distance, I saw 2 red lights. I walked towards them when my mind started to race. Something felt wrong. As I closed the distance, my guts were literally twisted. My mind was anxious, and I felt like I was about to break down. Then I realized what was wrong. Those weren't lights. They were 2 big, beady, solid red eyes. There were no pupils. They were just orbs hovering. I stood frozen in realization. I thought it was a big cat, but what emerged was much worse. Its fur was black, darker than the night around us. Its antlers grew twisted and uneven, but the worst part was it was crying blood. Deep red droplets were pelting down its unnatural face. I couldn't make a sound. I was frozen in fear. Then it made a sound like a baby crying. It was horrible. The sound of unnatural wails filled the cold air, making it worse. My body felt crumpled, so I finally broke out into a sprint. When I looked back, it was still there. It wasn't even breathing, but the sound of that baby crying wasn't fading. It was like a speaker was attached to my ear. When I made it to the camp, I rushed to pack my stuff. In a hurry, I ran, leaving the tent behind, and rushed onto my truck. As I fumbled with the keys, I saw that something was walking slowly towards me. That's when the whispering started. Terrible, faint voices echoed throughout the forest as my mind started to close. I felt my cerebral melting as I sat there in a kind of sleep paralysis. I found the strength to finally open the door and get in my car. I slammed it shut, and that thing was right at the window. I started to sob as I jammed the key in the ignition. My mind felt fried, and I swerved out of there. I didn't care if I hit anything. I just wanted to be away from that thing. Before I could properly back out, it stood on its legs, and it repeated a voice I recognized. You do not escape this. The forests are mine. It was my grandpa's voice. He died when I was 6, and I never knew any of the details. The thing then made a howl, a terrible shrieking howl that hurt my entire body. As it did so, I heard scampering as more of those things came out. They had blood running from their eyes as well. The baby cries started again, and that's when I finally drove out of that place. When I raced home, I immediately barged into my door. My shoulder ached, but I didn't care. I shoved the door and locked it and ran into the kitchen. That's when I saw my uncle sitting at the table, enjoying a glass of scotch. So, you saw what I did, didn't you, Anthony? I couldn't form words. I was so shocked. My uncle came up to me and put a hand on my shoulder. What you saw out there is my rule I abide by. There are things in those forests in winter that are so horrible even the most seasoned can't handle it. I saw it when I was a boy, and since then I don't hunt during the winter. I finally mustered a sentence. What was it? He took a deep breath before sitting down. You saw something called the Urabarak. It's an ancient being that dwells in the forest during these winters. Hunters who see it usually are never the same again, but some never come back home. I was lucky. My uncle sort of sniffed as he told me about his encounter with the Urubarak. When I was 23, my father and I went out into the woods on a very cold winter to hunt. Our family was struggling, so we didn't have much food. When we were hunting, my dad called out to me, but before I could even get to him, I heard him yell out before he went silent. I never saw him again, but what stood there was worse than the loss of my own. A deer with red eyes, black fur, and twisted antlers stood there. Blood ran from its eyes. Then it started to cry like a baby. My uncle broke down and had to take a few seconds before continuing. I comforted him as I was teary-eyed too. It ran after me, Anthony, on two legs. It was like a human, and I rushed to get away from it. But I wasn't quick enough. He rolled up his sleeve and revealed a terrible red scar that ran across the entire underside of his arm. It was trying to feast on me. It knew I feared it, but eventually I managed to lose it. He finally finished his scotch before continuing. I was stuck in those woods for 3 days, fighting to survive. I heard its cries and whispers all around as I tried to make it out. I finally arrived at the road and was taken in by police. No trace was ever found of my dad, except for one thing. They found blood at the scene and tested it. It was my father's. What was strange about it is it was mixed with his tears. My uncle finally stood up. Fear it, for it knows who you are. Those were his last words. He left my house, and the police found him wrapped up in a noose 2 days later. It broke me. My hunting buddy and best friend was gone. There was one detail about his suicide that was never resolved. He had droplets of blood coming from his eyes. The coroner inspected it and said it had been an aneurysm, but I'm not so sure that's the truth. I'm 50 now, and I haven't been hunting in 2 decades. I can't even go into the forest anymore. I'm thinking about going back and seeing what Urubarak is. Maybe I can kill him. Beware the Urubarak, for he lurks in the cold. It was a typical Friday evening for Chloe and her friends. They'd just finished watching a movie and decided to play hide-and-seek in Chloe's house. Chloe was it, and her friends scattered throughout the house to find hiding spots. Chloe searched the house from top to bottom, but she couldn't find her friends. She even searched the cellar, but it was empty. She was about to give up when she heard a faint whisper. It was coming from the corner of the cellar. Curious, Chloe walked towards the corner, but as she approached, the whispering stopped. She looked around, but nobody was there. Suddenly the lights went out, and Chloe was plunged into darkness. Panic set in as Chloe fumbled around for the light switch. Just as she found it, she heard a faint creaking noise. She turned around, and in the dim light, she saw a figure looming in front of her. It was tall and shadowy, with eyes that glowed red in the darkness. Chloe tried to scream, but no sound came out. She was frozen with fear as the figure began to move closer, step by step. Just as it was about to reach her, the lights flickered back on, and the figure disappeared. Shaken, Chloe stumbled upstairs and told her friends what had happened. They laughed it off, saying she was just imagining things. But Chloe knew what she'd seen. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Over the next few weeks, strange things continued to happen in the house. Doors would open and close on their own, and Chloe could hear footsteps in the cellar, even when nobody was there. She started to feel like she was going crazy, and her friends started to distance themselves from her. One night, Chloe decided to confront her fear and go back into the cellar. As she descended the stairs, she felt a cold breeze brush past her, and she could see her breath in the air. The whispering started again, but this time it was louder and more incessant. Chloe followed the sound until she reached a dark corner of the cellar. As she peered into the darkness, she saw a pair of red eyes staring back at her. With a sudden burst of courage, she stepped towards them and reached out to touch. As her hands brushed against the eyes, she felt a cold, slimy hand wrap around her wrist. She screamed and tried to pull away, but the hand was too strong. The whispering grew louder and more intense, and Chloe felt like she was being pulled into the darkness. Just as she thought she was going to be dragged into the abyss, the lights flickered on again, and the hand released her. Chloe stumbled back, gasping for breath, and saw that the cellar was empty once again. From that day on, Chloe never went back into the cellar again. She moved out of the house soon after, but the memory of the cold, slimy hand and the glowing red eyes stayed with her forever. She still wonders what would have happened if the lights hadn't come back on. I can't remember when I started feeling like I was being watched, but it had been going on for weeks. Every time I turned around, I would see something moving out of the corner of my eye. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but as the days went on, I became more and more convinced that something was following me. One night I woke up to a cold chill in the air. The bedroom window was open, even though I'd closed it before going to bed. As I sat up, I saw a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was dark and shadowy, but I could feel its presence. I tried to scream, but my voice was caught in my throat. The figure began to move closer, its movements slow and deliberate. As it drew near, I could see that it was covered in blood. Its eyes were empty sockets, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. The figure reached out and touched my forehead, and suddenly, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in a pool of my own blood. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but I could feel its presence lingering in the room. I stumbled out of bed and ran to the bathroom, my heart pounding in my chest. As I looked in the mirror, I realized I wasn't alone. There were dozens of faces staring back at me, all twisted in agony. They seemed to be reaching out to me, as if begging for help. I tried to look away, but their eyes held me captive. In a panic, I ran out of the house and into the street, but no matter where I turned, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being followed. I could hear whispers and laughter coming from the shadows, but when I looked, there was no one there. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. The faces in the mirror became more and more real, until they were almost tangible. I could feel their breath on my skin, their fingers brushing against my hair. Then one night, I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of the street, covered in blood. I didn't know how I'd gotten there, or what had happened. But as I looked around, I could see dozens of faces staring back at me, their eyes empty, and their mouths twisted in agony. I knew then that I was haunted, and that there was no escape. The faces would follow me wherever I went, and I would be trapped in this nightmare forever. As Maya stumbled through the forest, the darkness enveloped her like a suffocating cloak. The trees swayed and groaned in the howling wind, and the rustling of leaves was the only sound to be heard. She had taken a shortcut to get back to her campsite, but now she had lost her bearings and didn't know which way to go. Suddenly she heard a faint whisper in the darkness, like a voice from the other side. Maya's heart began to race as she tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. but there was no one there, only the trees and the wind. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. Maya could make out the words now, but they didn't make any sense. They were like fragments of a language she had never heard before, twisted, distorted. Then she saw them, a pair of eyes glowing in the darkness like twin flames. They were fixed on her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Maya tried to run, but her feet wouldn't obey her. She was frozen in place, like a rabbit caught in a hunter's trap. The eyes drew closer, and Maya could see they belonged to a figure, tall and lean, with sharp claws and teeth like knives. It moved with a grace that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Maya knew without a doubt she was face to face with a monster. The creature lunged at her, its claws tearing at her flesh. Maya screamed, but the sound was drowned out by her own heartbeat. She fought back with all her might, but the monster was too strong, too fast. Just when she thought it was all over, the creature stopped, as if it had lost interest. It turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Maya alone and bleeding in the middle of the forest. Days later, Maya was found by a group of hikers, barely alive. She was taken to the hospital, where she underwent multiple surgeries to repair the damage done to her body. Even as she recovered physically, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She began to hear whispers in the darkness, the same twisted language that the monster had spoken. She saw the glowing eyes in her dreams, and sometimes, even when she was awake. She knew that the monster was still out there, waiting for her. Maya tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the trauma had caused her mind to play tricks on her. But deep down, she knew that the monster was real. One day, she would have to face it again. It was supposed to be a fun birthday party, but something felt off from the very beginning. The decorations were all in place, the balloons and streamers creating a festive atmosphere. But there was a definite sense of unease. As the guests arrived, they too felt the strangeness of the party. The music was too loud, the laughter too forced, and there was someone missing, the birthday girl herself. As the hours passed, the guests began to notice strange occurrences. Objects moving on their own, doors slamming shut, whispers in the dark corners of the room. They brushed it off as their imagination, but the unease continued to grow. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in as the guests fumbled for their phones, trying to find some source of light. And then they heard it, the sound of someone or something moving in the darkness. The guests huddled together, their hearts racing as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Then a voice spoke up out of the darkness, a voice that belonged to no one in the room. "Happy birthday," it said, the words dripping with malice. The guests screamed and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. The voice continued to taunt them, and they could hear the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. Suddenly, the lights came back on. The room was empty, except for a birthday cake, with a strange candle flickering on top. The guests breathed a sigh of relief, thinking it was all just a prank. Then, they noticed something strange about the cake. The icing spelled out a message reading, "You're next." As they turned to leave, they saw her, the birthday girl, standing in the corner with a look of pure terror on her face. She'd been missing all night. Now she was here, but she was different somehow. She had a dark, otherworldly aura about her. The guests knew that they had to leave, but the door still wouldn't open. As they huddled together, trying to find a way out, they heard the sound of scratching at the door and a low growl that made their blood run cold. They were trapped with whatever horror had taken over the birthday girl, and they knew that their chances of survival were slim. The birthday party had turned into a nightmare, and there was no escape. I found 2 corpses in the woods. Hello, everyone. I found something super unsettling, and I'm writing to see if any of you can help me make sense of it. Okay, so some background. I was adopted when I was a baby. I didn't know until I turned 18. On my birthday, though, my mom, adopted mom, but she raised me, so, told me it was time for us to talk. My mind started racing. What did I do? Did I screw up something? I'm mostly an introvert who stays at home and doesn't get into trouble. I'm a good student. I couldn't fathom what could have been so serious that she'd have to give me a look like that. Am I in trouble? Her eyes softened and she chuckled as she held my hand. I felt the icy touch of her skin. My mom's always struggled with blood flow in her limbs, so she's always freezing. I think it's called Raynaud or something. Her fingers got absolutely white when it's cold. I always joked, saying she had dead fingers. Anyway, I'm drifting away. Carrying on. You did nothing wrong, sweetheart. There's just something we never told you, and Dad and I think you're old enough to know. Right, Mike? Dad looked uncertain. Right, I guess. I'm getting worried. What are you going to tell me? There was silence. Oh, come on, spit it out. What are you going to tell me? I'm adopted or something? It was a joke, and I let it out with a nervous laugh. Honestly, it had crossed my mind. My mom had blue eyes, my dad had green, but I had dark brown eyes. When I learned about genetic probability and recessive genes in school, it struck me as odd and planted a seed of doubt in me. My dad scratched the back of his head and looked away. My mom dropped my hand and stared at my shoes, touching the tips of her fingers rapidly and nervously. My laughter died when it dawned on me that I'd hit the bullseye. Wait, really? Is this true? Are you pranking me or something? Honey, it's not a prank. It's true. We wanted you to be old enough to understand. That's why it took so long to tell you. My mind was racing. It changed everything, but then again, did it? We got you from a lady that... There's no way to sugarcoat it. She didn't want kids. You'd been born at home, so there was no registration. She found us somehow. I'm not even sure how, but I think she had some inside information from the clinic that followed your mom, my dad continued. As we were trying to conceive, we came to the conclusion that I was infertile. We know what we did wasn't right, but we took you and registered you as if you were our own biological child. It raised some eyebrows, but we came up with an excuse and things worked out. This is a lot, I said. We know, honey. My mom took my hand again, but we wanted you to know that we loved you exactly the same as if you were born from my own womb. For 2 years, I let it go, but the question was still there. Who was my biological family? So this year, as I turned 20, I asked my mom. She was a bit scared, but she ended up pointing me towards an address in the town nearby. She told me the woman who brought me gave a fake name, which makes sense given the situation. I decided I'd go there, looking for anything that could help. When I got to the town, my first thought was heading to the police station. I said I was looking for my biological family and gave them the address. The officer looked at me with a suspicious face. What's your name again? It's Lizzie. Okay, Lizzie, you must have the wrong address. The address you gave me belongs to a lady that doesn't have kids. She did have a baby about 20 years ago, but the baby had been presumed dead since she was 2 weeks old. I quickly did my math. I was 20. His eyes widened. Can I see your ID? The man took my ID and confirmed my age. Without a second thought, he went to the back and called an old man. I supposed it must be his boss. Here's the one I was telling you about. Hello, miss. I take it that you're Lizzie. Hello, yes I am, sir. He grabbed a newspaper cutout and looked at it, his eyes darting between me and the photo in his hand. I mean, it could be her. Look at the eyes and the nose, he pointed out to the other man. Yeah, but right now? What are we supposed to do? They looked tense. I was close to losing my patience. Excuse me, can you point me to the person you're talking about? They looked at each other. The younger man sighed while the older one just scratched his head. They both looked at a loss. The younger man leaned against the counter and talked to me softly. Look, kid, you couldn't have chosen a worse time to come, honestly. What do you mean? The lady you're looking for, the one that might be your mom, she went missing about 3 months ago, along with one of our officers. What do you mean? Like she ran away? No. See those bullet holes there? He pointed at the wall across the door. Those bullets were aimed at the lady you're looking for. We had search parties out for over a month, but we couldn't find her or the officer that was protecting her. It was a complex case. I can't give you a lot of details. If you ask around, though, I'm sure you'll find plenty of people willing to give you the scoop. It was kind of a big deal. I felt tears flooding my eyes. Without a word, I turned and left. I needed to go for a walk. I needed to think. I had no idea why I was so worried and upset about a woman who gave me away when I was a baby, who didn't even want me. But I wanted to find her, to know that she was okay, to ask her why she didn't want me. At least then I'd understand why. I kept walking until I found myself in the woods. The place was calm and the breeze was fresh and light. The air smelled a lot better than in the city, and the rays of sun dripped solidly through the leaves. I sighed as I sat on a rock. That's when it hit me. A smelly, really bad smell. A smell that would have anyone leave as soon as possible. But for some dumb reason, I followed it. I don't know what crossed my mind. I just did. What I found will keep me up at night for as long as I live. 2 corpses, mostly rotten, barely identifiable. A man and a woman. Their clothes were so dirty and mixed with fluids that you could barely make out the colors. I think the man was dressed in blue. The woman, I'm not so sure. Next to them was something I had never seen before, and gave the whole thing an even weirder and gag-worthy vibe. It looked like a pair of prosthetic legs, but they were hollow. You know, like props that are used in the movies. I was looking at all of that, completely horrified, when I heard leaves rustling. It was steps. I called out for help, and a man accepted. Hey, over here! Oh my God, you have to help me. I found 2 dead bodies. I see. The man looked at the bodies, and to my surprise, he wasn't thrown off by them even a little bit. The look on my face must have given me away, because he laughed and said, "Oh, don't worry. I'm a criminal investigator. I deal with dead bodies all the time." I calmed down a bit. It appeared I was in good hands. A few minutes ago, he told me he was going to call in his team and went back to his car. I'm writing this because I'm wondering what to do. I'm absolutely horrified and traumatized. Oh, I still have no leads on my biological parents. I was going to call the police, but the man told me this is way above their heads and asked me to stay here while he handled it. I think I'm going to trust him. P.S. The man's back, and he brought me a cup of tea from his car. How nice of him. So, I've got an update. Sorry for not posting earlier, but the man started getting annoyed with me fumbling around on my phone. Told him I was just checking up with friends and told them I'd be late, but at some point he told me to put it away. He was kind of sharp about it, and I got scared. When I posted, some of you started commenting, urging me not to drink the tea. It also looks like you guys are more aware of my situation here than I am myself. Although it was advertised by strangers on the internet, I decided to take your advice. It was hard, though. At first I thought I could just get by without drinking the tea. However, the man started to grow more impatient. Why aren't you drinking the tea? I'm feeling nauseated. Sorry. Okay, but keep it. It'll be good for you. It's really good tea. It helps with upset stomachs. Okay, I will. So, he asked, sitting on the rock beside me, what's your name? Lizzie. Hello, Lizzie. That's a nice name. Is it short for Alyssa? Huh? I remembered the comments telling me to be careful and decided to lie. No, it's actually short for Elizabeth. In fact, it is short for Alyssa. Apparently my biological mother asked my mom to keep the name she'd given me, and she'd complied. It struck me as weird that this man went straight to Alyssa, since it's more common to be short for Elizabeth. I see. How old are you, Lizzie? The truth slipped out before I could stop it. I'm 20. I chastised myself internally for sharing that piece of information. His eyes seemed to sparkle, and I knew I'd screwed up. I see. What a wonderful age. What are you doing around town? How did he know that I wasn't from here? Everything seemed to start clicking into place, showing me I was in real danger. I put my hand in my pocket and disabled my phone's sound. I came to see my friend. How did you know I was visiting? His eyes squinted as if he'd hit his finger with a hammer. He realized he'd messed up. It's a small town. I've never seen you around. I just took a guess, he said with a shrug. I smiled and nodded. My insides scrambled in fear. As we were talking, I fussed around in my pocket to dial for help. It caught his attention. What's up with your pocket? Oh, nothing. My hand's itchy, that's all. He looked suspicious, but seemed to believe me. Well, it's about time you drink that tea. Come on, bottoms up. I realized I couldn't stall for long without looking suspicious. I had to come up with a plan. It was time to bring my clumsy self to action. I got up as if I was about to take a big sip. I kept the tea in my mouth and pretended to swallow. Right after I was up, I pretended to trip and spill the tea, along with spitting the one I had in my mouth. With all the commotion, he didn't notice I was spitting. Shoot, clumsy girl, he yelled, clearly frustrated. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. He sighed. You drank a bit at least, didn't you? I did. It was very nice, thank you. He seemed to relax and smiled. There was something utterly creepy about that smile. Okay, good. Soon it'll be okay. You won't even remember any of this happening. I shivered. I remembered the comments about my mother being drugged and not remembering anything. It made sense. This is the man who hurt my mom. When is the team coming? Don't worry about it. It comes when it comes. Can I leave? It's getting dark. No, you were the one that found the bodies. You have to stay and give your statement. He wasn't going to let me leave. I went for a Hail Mary. Okay, but my mom will be looking for me. She knows I'm in town. I need to call her and let her know. He looked at me and seemed to ponder his options for a moment. Having someone looking for me didn't seem to amuse him, so he told me to call her. I took my phone and dialed 911. I stepped away, just enough for him not to hear my voice, or the voice on the other side, and lowered the speaker volume. 911, what's your emergency? Hi, Mom, it's me, Lizzie. I'm going to be late today. The responder seemed to pick up on my cue. Ma'am, are you unable to talk freely? Yeah, exactly. Are you in immediate danger? I think so, Mom. I'm not sure when I'm coming back home. I found something unsettling in the woods. I'm here with a gentleman. He says he's a detective, but I can't leave right now. Are you being coerced to stay with this man? Yeah, that's it. The woods near Franklin, exactly. Okay, ma'am, stay on the line. I have an officer on the way. We're able to trace your call. Yeah, no, I don't think I can. The man started to yell at me. What's taking so long? Okay, ma'am, I understand. Keep the call going, mute the speaker, and lock your phone. Put it in your pocket and act normally. I'll stay here and make sure that everything's fine on our end, and we'll get you some help. Okay, Mom, I love you. See you later. I did as instructed. The speaker muted, my phone locked and in my pocket. I sat back next to the man. How are you feeling? He asked. Mostly okay, I think. Okay. In about 10 minutes, things are going to start getting better. Is the team arriving? Huh? Oh, something like that. I assumed he was talking about the tea. I had no idea what the effect should be, so I just sat there, quiet and idle. I got lost in thought, and without noticing, I found myself looking into the distance. Finally, I see the tea is working. Let's try it. Repeat after me. My name is Alyssa. I didn't move an inch. Apparently staring into the horizon was what he expected me to do. My name is Alyssa. I'm 20 years old. I'm 20 years old. I live in Franklin with my dad, Rob. Wait, what? Was this guy trying to reprogram me? Was that what the tea was for? I live in Franklin with my dad, Rob. I don't know anyone apart from my dad who's here with me. I don't know anyone apart from my dad who's here with me. I could hear sirens in the distance. Apparently, he could hear them too, because he stood up and suddenly stared at me. You little bitch. Okay, repeat this exact phrase when I ask you to. This is my dad. We found these bodies while on a hike. I want to go home now, please. A police car pulled up, followed by another. 2 men with heavy guns exited. Hello, officer. What seems to be the problem? Identify yourself, sir. I was just taking a hike with my daughter here. Sir, identify yourself, now. Just ask my daughter. I'm telling you the truth. Honey, tell these men who I am. I stood up, pretending I was going to talk to the officer, to repeat the phrase that he told me to. As soon as I was close enough, I sprinted behind the police cars. Please help. He tried to drug me. I was the one who called. The officers shielded me. The man, Rob, I guess, turned around and started running away. 3 officers sprinted after him, guns in hand, and the 4th one stood with me. Finally out of sight, I let my emotions overcome me and broke down, sobbing. You're safe now, miss. I'll take you back to the local police station. At the police station, I spent most of the night giving statements and describing the man so they could draw one of those portraits they do when they don't have a picture. I spent the rest of the night here because they thought it was safer to take me home in the morning. I called my mom and filled her in. She was scared out of her mind. Some minutes ago, my mom called me again. Honey, where are you? I'm still at the police station. Why? There's a detective at our door. He says he needs to talk. I thought they were supposed to bring you home. One of the first things my EMS cert teacher told me was that the touchiness would pass. That one day I'd be slipping IV needles into arms as easily as I flossed between my teeth. Yet, I was 2 weeks into my first full-time ambulance gig, and I was still shaking between calls. The 3-story inferno raging downtown didn't help, but that's not where me and my partner Tom were heading. Prior to this whole situation, our night was quiet, mostly dealing with confused dementia patients or burgeoning schizophrenics. The MO is either to find their medicine or transport them to the hospital. Most of our calls were like that, low stakes, right in my comfort zone. But now we were dispatched to a Priority 2 emergency, the kind of call that necessitates the whole lights and siren deal. Someone called in a possible self-harm situation involving one of their neighbors. Serious stuff, but I had Tom with me. He was a vet, a former cop, and I was always in his steady hands. The issue was that the downtown inferno had really messed traffic up for 2 solid miles in front and behind us. We hadn't moved more than 10 yards in about 5 minutes, and even though it was protocol to have a police response as well, we were as close to the front as it got. Hell, we were the front line at that point. Another minute passed in gridlock before Tom finally blurted out, "You gotta go alone." And there was really no other way. Abandoning the ambulance and blocking further fire trucks wasn't an option. Solo responses were rare, sure, but it was necessary in desperate circumstances like this. I knew it was coming, but it was the last thing I wanted to hear. Don't get me wrong, I wanted to go. Deep in my heart, I would be willing to lay my life down for a patient. I wanted so badly to be that type of cool, methodical mind that entered an emergency situation and eased their patient back from the brink. It just hadn't come to me yet. Tom saw it. I'm sure if seconds weren't the difference between life and death, he would have given me 5 minutes for a pep talk. For now, though, all he could do was pat my shoulder and smirk. "Knock 'em alive, kid." So out I went, squeezing myself between the bumper-to-bumper traffic until I found myself on the correct cross street. There's something horrifying in the minutes between their call and your arrival. The feeling creeps in while you're slipping over broken sidewalks and homeless tents, realizing you're the beginning and the end of their recovery. It all comes down to you, the practitioner. To be blunt, you're God for those few minutes, and God was having a pretty bad time gaining entry. Someone buzzed me in, but of course, apartment 13B was locked. Our response time was already woefully long, so waiting for police to break it down was not an option. I went to town using my bump key, prying it open less with finesse and more with raw, frantic energy. The door opened to near complete darkness. I saw candles around the corner and the end of the hall, but a whole lot of unknown was between me and there. Light switches were oddly dead, so my flashlight had to guide my feet. From the little I could see, it was a well-lived-in apartment. At least 2 generations had sunk their essence into the carpet. That's when the smell hit. It was familiar, the scent of a man. No, not exactly, no. It was like my granddad's musk. I hadn't smelled it since I was in his lap as a kid, but the recall was instantaneous. It made me feel oddly safe, which lasted only a few seconds, considering what I would soon see. Around the corner, there was a metric ton of candles in the living room. Every surface was covered with them. Weirdly, the wax was melting from every kind of receptacle except a candle jar. Bowls, mugs, shot glasses. The source of the musk, no doubt. They cast the entire room in a homemade devilish glow. They lit the way to the girl I would come to know as Ellie. She had wrapped herself up in the corner, laying motionless. Baggy sweats and a white tee hid her frailty at a glance. I rushed to her, set her on her back, and began to triage. First was the bruising on her neck. It was fresh, must have tried some sort of strangulation, but it wasn't what did her in, so I quickly moved on. Blood caked her white t-shirt. I followed it to her wrists. They were messy slashes, but they didn't look deep enough to do real harm. That's when I noticed the culprit of my light switch woes. Sloppily wound duct tape attached a fork to her hand, just a foot away from the charred-out power outlet. Christ, she'd electrocuted herself. Full cardiac arrest. She could have died in the seconds it took me to triage. My hand found position and began compressions. I regained some confidence as I found my rhythm, laying the foundation of the AED to work its magic. The repetitiveness gave me my first moment to take Ellie in. She was young, maybe even younger than my 19-year-old sister. Her being in this position seemed so wrong. I could see this face getting drunk at a college party, waiting tables at a diner in town, but not here. I thought about the second chance I wanted to give her as I continued compressions. That's when the room started to feel warm. The candle scent now got a bit clearer. It wasn't the manly musk of someone's grandfather. It was an animalistic scent. Dried blood and mange. Something that activated a long-buried fight-or-flight instinct in my primitive genes. I had to keep on with my compressions, though. Even if I had lost track of time, I might have been way short of 2 minutes when I decided to stop CPR and pick up the AED. It wasn't until I'd unzipped the bag that I realized this was the first time I'd used the AED in the field. I'd learned the ins and outs, tested it on course dummies, and seen others use it, but I'd never actually been tasked to use it in the field. I pulled up her shirt and applied the wire pads, again feeling a warmth that sent a bead of sweat down my neck. Finally, me, the naive idiot, decided to turn it on. The flames of the candle array now burned twice as bright. They licked high enough to start to uncover some of the shadows against the wall, revealing scraggy-looking wallpaper. No time to admire the settings, though. I waited patiently as the AED robotically counted down and administered the first shock. It picked up heartbeat rhythm automatically, but I still used my fingers to feel her absent pulse directly. It remained still. No response. Desperate, I repositioned my fingers as I checked for a pulse, and I didn't find one. Of that I was supremely confident. My fingers wiped some of the blood from her wrist as I did. Only now did I decide her cuts weren't at all random. They, in fact, cut out symbols in her flesh. A star. No, that was a pentagram. But the affirmative boop of the AED took my mind off the task. It rejiggered her heartbeat, automatically suspending its shocks. Any weirdness I felt came secondary to my resumed chest compressions. Resuscitation, especially with a faint heartbeat like this, always felt to me like pulling someone from quicksand. You're shoulder deep, clinging to a couple of fingers, hanging onto that little grip as you try to extract the entire person. If you're good, that little grip's all you need. I pumped with that metaphor in my mind's eye, laser focused on my goal. For 15 seconds, I felt like the ideal practitioner I dreamed of being, reeling my patient back from the brink. Until, I shit you not, the flames gained a life of their own. At first I thought it was just the ones directly in front of me, but as I spun I realized it animated every live flame, each one dancing its way towards the ceiling, causing the receptacles to bubble over with wax. You spend a lifetime watching flames move randomly, flicking with the wind, and I promise you their sudden conscious movement will rattle you to your depths. A full red light illuminated what I now realized wasn't wallpaper. It was blood-inked writing, overlapping scrawls of mantras over every wall and even possibly the ceiling. I imagined her crawling like a spider as she wrote, "Praise be all glory to the true one, may his new kingdom reign." Then finally the one spanning the entire main room. "May my blood serve as sacrifice." I suddenly felt like an interloper in a place I should not be, intruding on an ancient ritual. Whatever had its grip on her seemed to be in the room with me now. The flames kept up their height so I could take it all in, wax spilling over onto the floor. Looking back now, I think it was offering me a chance to reconsider what I was doing. It had its claim on her, but as her practitioner, I felt I had an equal claim. I resumed compressions, faster now, desperate to get her back as fast as possible. The flames swirled, seeming enraged by this development, and not letting me forget it. Yet somehow I was able to separate my technique from my panic-ridden nerves, keeping a tight rhythm for almost a minute before the girl finally snapped upright. The flames dissipated in an instant, down to tiny weak flickers. Her eyes were shut at first, like she was still within a blissful dream. Then her eyes opened to what she seemed to clearly think was a nightmare. Where'd he go? Where is he? She seemed taken by complete surprise, grounding herself back in reality as she pawed at herself. My practiced lines of patient comfort only enraged her. You have to let me get back. With rabid panic, she started to grab at her wrists, but soon realized it wasn't the most economic method of return. I finally regained my composure just as I saw her eyes meet the burned outlet. I screamed and grabbed at her leg, but her hand stretched to reach it. It connected, but unfortunately, it seemed she'd blown that out completely the last time. No shock was administered. Ellie kicked me off and stood, searching for a weapon, for a way out. It gave me a second to reason with her, person to person. That practiced BS now scared right out of me, but she responded with a level-headed reason that made it feel almost like she was speaking in my best interest. You don't understand. I'm the last one. He needs me. She raced across the room to the dresser, rifling through the top drawer. I went to pull her off when she struck me hard across the face. It wasn't a punch to harm as much as a utility swipe, keeping me away as economically as possible. I was a few feet away when she pulled the knife from the drawer. There wasn't any fanfare, no waiting to see the horrified look on my face. She just sliced it as fast as she possibly could. I don't remember if it was 2 or 3 good hacks before Tom rushed in to tackle her. In one swoop, he was able to pin her while cleanly plucking the blade from her grip. Blood pooled as he steadied her flailing arms with ease, getting the one she had sliced into the open. You okay? Once we had established that I was at least physically unharmed, I got back to work wrapping her wrist, stopping the brunt of the blood flow. Tom reinstated order to my rapidly deteriorating nightmare. As much as she wailed and cried in that first minute, she settled completely as she was padded up and restrained for transport. Her dead eyes followed me back and forth across the room as I spoke to the police officers that had arrived, burned into my scalp even when I turned around. She seemed to have come to a realization, something that set her at complete peace even here in the reality she had been forced back into. Stupid me, I reasoned that maybe I'd given her a new lease on life, something she would cherish. Stupid. That was a week ago. There were 5 total ritual suicides that night, aside from Ellie. All were successful. The first was a young artist who burned herself on a pyre, setting her warehouse studio aflame. That was the inferno that caught Tom and I in the traffic heap. My first patient died 2 days later. He was a 12-year-old boy suffering from asphyxia after eating some mislabeled Chinese food. An EpiPen was administered by his mom, but it wasn't enough. We arrived in time and got the epinephrine IV in. However, his heart responded in a bizarre fashion. It began to rapidly slow with the increasing dose. He wasn't just dying, it was like I was killing him. He died so fast it took his mom 2 minutes to realize. The longest 2 minutes of my life. 1 is a fluke, but 6 are a pattern. 5 more of my patients would die, some with completely non-life-threatening conditions. My supervisor comforted me after the first, but things darkened quickly from there. Despite the fact that I was investigated and could not have done anything different, I was suspended indefinitely. It took me almost a week to find Ellie. From the hospital, they bounced her between a few psych wards until landing her at one for, shall we say, more intense cases. Despite this, their windows were not barred, just thick and secured tight with latches. Something told me hers would be unlocked. It was. She's sleeping, Been this way for the last hour. I've gripped and released the knife in my pocket 100 times over, though. I'm smashed right now, drunk as hell, with a lot of emotions gyrating about my head. My mind space is a concoction of fear and anger. For the past 4 hours, I've drank vodka and orange juice, vodka, cranberry juice, and finally, vodka and grape juice. That's a load of screwdrivers, cosmopolitans, and I don't know, whatever you call vodka and grape juice. Well, maybe I'll make up my own name. The Crystal Room. Okay, that's dumb, but whatever. It's the Crystal Room that's on my mind right now. I had to drink myself sloppy just to have the courage to write down my experience. I have to get all the details straight and not stray too far from the truth. In 2001, my wife and I went to New York City. Surprisingly, I loved it, except for my final days there. A southerner in New York, I got the worst asinine advice and general characterization from my buddies at work. One was, don't stare at anybody on the subway. They don't like being stared at. Well, who the hell does? I don't want to live in a city where the people like being stared at. It's creepy, if otherwise. People are genuinely nice. I never had any issue with anyone on the subway, but then again, I didn't just sit there staring at people like they were animals in the zoo. Next to the last day of our vacation, we visited Times Square. I was intrigued by the constant action, the incessant visual and auditory stimuli. There was so much to see, so much to hear. My mind was scattered and unfocused. There was flashing lights and advertisements and constant blur of nameless faces and mindless crowds. I was enjoying it, but I was also a little overwhelmed. I asked my wife if we could go back to the hotel, but she wasn't ready to end the day. She assured me she was quite capable of taking care of herself. Just go back to the hotel. I won't be much longer. I can take care of myself. You sure? I said. I can tough it out. No, go, please. I'll be fine. So I walked to the nearest subway station and rode back to our hotel, which was at the end of the line in Flushing, Queens. When I got to our hotel, I slumped down in the bed and fell asleep. I was exhausted. I woke up around 3 in the morning. The bed was empty, besides me. I picked up my cell phone and called her, but I got no answer. There was a text. Honey, meet me at the Crystal Rose Room. It's just down the street from the hotel. Time on the text was 2 a.m. I remembered the place. It stood out amongst all the other crowded storefronts with a big old neon sign of a scantily dressed woman holding a red rose. What was my wife doing at a strip club? She was a regular churchgoer, never missing and always insisting I go with her. Something didn't seem quite right. I got dressed in a hurry and went down to the club. I tried to bowl my way through, but the bouncer pushed me back, shoving his large open palm into my chest. No, sir. Only invited guests are allowed. I got a text from my wife. She's inside. What's her name? Catherine Bressler. Oh, hell yeah, Mr. Bressler. Come on in. We've been expecting you." The courteous welcome shocked me, considering that a moment before he was ready to stomp me into the ground. In a flash of a moment, I went from being a nuisance to a highly regarded guest of honor. I walked through the front door and into the past. It was an old-fashioned cabaret with the waitresses dressed in flappers, bearded dresses, and floral headbands. They were all wearing outlandish large pearl necklaces, and there was a pianist playing ragtime music with a boisterous horn assembly. The air was thick with smoke and cheap perfume. My eyes were watering, but I felt eerily comfortable, like this was where I truly belonged. On the center stage, dressed in a tight, short flapper dress, was my wife, Catherine. She was dancing as if in a trance. A man walked up on the stage and started kissing her. My wife seemed to be enjoying it a lot, and I ran up to the front of the stage. Hey, damn it, get your hands off my wife." The man stopped, turned his gaze towards me, and smiled. His mouth was full of yellow, jagged teeth, encrusted with thick layers of plaque. My wife looked at me and smiled, revealing a similar set of teeth, smaller but no less hideous. I could no longer live a lie. I want my old life back, and I know you will too, she said. Catherine, let's get out of here. This isn't funny. I don't like this. But baby, I do. Two men grabbed me and dragged me to one of the back rooms. They pointed a gun at me and shoved me into a wooden chair. They turned the lights out and walked out of the room. I tried to run and grab the doorknob before they locked it, but I was too late. I heard a mechanical whirring and a pink light overhead was turned on. I couldn't see where the light was coming from, whether it was a lamp or a fixture in the ceiling. It almost seemed mystical, coming from an unknown source. The room now looked like I was inside a diamond with a rigid crystalline structure. There were 1,000 reflections of myself, walking through the many faces of the crystal, independent of my own motion. They were alive in themselves, more than a mere reflection. One of them called out to me, "It's time to come back to your true self." I smiled with an impressive row of sharp teeth, more immaculate, more regal than what the groping stranger my wife had. My reflection stepped out of the crystal and into the plain hardwood floor, progressing slowly towards me with his hands raised, the nails of which were long and sharp. The closer he got, the paler his skin grew. He was dressed in a black suit with a colorless vest and bow tie. Atop his head was a straw boater hat. He grabbed me by the throat, and as his cold, rigid fingers touched me, I had a vision of bygone times filled with murder and debauchery. I killed and drank, lapping up the warm blood, copper-tinged blood of many hapless victims. In my past life, I was a monster, a man willing to kill anyone, constantly thirsting for blood, never satisfied. You trapped me here, but I knew Catherine would never stay away. I knew the memories would come back. The thrill and the passion of it all would well up in her soul again. I fought back, pushing him away, but he lunged back at me, grabbing my wrist and bit on the side of my hand. I could feel the pressure of his mouth tightening as he sucked in as much blood as he can. His white skin began to fill with color. I punched at his head, knocking his hat to the ground. "Damn you! That's a nice hat. Don't you fight me. I am who you are, and you are me. There's no escaping." I noticed that now there were many different people, monsters, in the crystals. They were no longer my own reflection. They all looked hideous and weak, trapped in the purgatory by my own better selves. He lunged at me, but this time he flew at me head first. I dodged him, and as he came closer to the opposite wall of the crystal room, he yelled in exasperation, holding his hands out to avoid hitting his head against the wall. His hand was engulfed by that wall, submerged up to the elbow. He was laying on his stomach. "No! Pull me out! Don't do this! Don't you want to be good again? Don't you want to be God again? The power! The power!" I knew what I had to do at that point. He'd revealed too much. I put my hands on his ass and pushed the rest of his body through the crystalline wall. He appeared on the other side of that wall, banging with his fists and pleading me to let him out. "You son of a bitch, you'll be back. You can try to deny what you are, but the thirst and hunger is always there. It might be buried deep, but it's always there. And soon you'll miss your, or should I say, our Catherine." All around the room were trapped souls, damned vampiric souls waiting for their better halves to come to their senses and embrace the darkness that was once an innate part of their existence, boldly committing to the passion of murder and gluttony. They were screeching and hollering for release. I wanted to get out of the room. Visions of who I used to be were displayed across the crystals. I remembered who I was and when I was born. It was over 100 years ago. I thirsted. I hungered. I killed and destroyed families, mostly preying on the weak. And then, there she was, Catherine, a murderer, fell in love. I couldn't kill her, even though my stomach felt empty as my hunger was uncontrollable. I bit her, but not to kill, only to bring her into my world with me, forever. She hated me for that, and then I found the rose crystal room. I wanted to give her back a normal existence. I kill her feeling guilty. We gave up the demons, but at a price. One day we would have to come back and once again don the cloak of a murderer, but this time in his service, obeying his every whim. The world needed balance, according to the proprietor of this fair saloon. It needed hunters to weed out the weak. I remember now, he was known as the Scarlet Shepherd. The door opened. "You're not quite ready, but you've had your time. I'm not erasing your memory. I'm not giving Catherine back either. You belong to me, but I don't want it until you're ready." I looked up to see a thin man in a red suit with a long black tie. He was wearing a black tweed cap and a chain with an upside-down cross. His goons grabbed me by the arms and dragged me out of the room, and in front of Catherine, there on stage with her now was a homeless man, dressed in ragged clothes and smelling like liquor. She looked at me and smiled and buried her teeth in his neck. He struggled, but her grasp was too strong. She drank him dry. He collapsed to the floor. "You made me. You love me. And I know one day you'll come back." I was thrown out onto the street, lonely and without my wife. The shadow of my former self still lives. I left New York with new and old memories. Some I'd hoped I would never discover again. I drink to forget my sins, but mostly to forget Catherine. I tell myself that I killed her years ago, that she never survived, and that I never really ever loved her. But then again, I told you in the beginning that I didn't want to stray too far from the truth. The truth is, I'd kill 1,000,000 souls to have her back again. The old monk looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun with his hands. The clouds looked strange, black and thick, curling like smoke above where he now sat on top of the mountain. "So it has started," he said. I heard him from farther down the trail, carrying a pail of water for us to drink. Back then, as a 7-year-old boy, I lived in the nearby village. I always wished to learn from the monk. They know secrets, after all. "Oh, Father," I said, dropping the heavy pails of water on top of the mountain, where the monk sat in his ochre robes, his legs crossed full lotus in the eternal symbol of meditation. "What are those clouds, do you think?" He didn't look up at me, but for a moment I thought he might not respond. "Boy, there are things in this world you don't know yet. The wonders of enlightenment, yes, but also the strange evil demons who rule the sky and torture the evildoers in Naraka. They see I am weak, and that I have not yet attained enlightenment. They come here to torment me, to see that I am reborn," the monk said, his voice wavering and cracking as he came to the last word. "They know I have failed. I have not attained nirvana." The old monk did look weak. His hands trembled, and his legs under his robes looked like thin, brittle sticks. His eyes watered constantly, drooping, the whites looking more like yellow jelly than sclera. But in the center of those eyes, I saw a blazing determination and a deep energy. "All beings know the horror of rebirth. Is that not true, old father?" I asked, sitting down beside him. He shook his head. "I will not," he said bluntly, his voice gaining strength and volume. "I will not be reborn. This cycle must end. This is my last body. I swear it on the sky, on the trees, on the mountain that we sit upon. The demon will not win." The old monk had gone to a doctor. The doctor had looked at him, his sickly and jaundiced appearance, and had immediately begun running tests. "You have terminal liver cancer," the doctor said. "I'm sorry, but you will not live out the month. It has progressed too far." "So it has. So it has. All things must arise and pass away." "I can write you a prescription for," the doctor began, but the monk waved him off. "No medicine. Thank you for telling me this great secret, doctor. The secret of my death. Now I have time." After speaking these cryptic words, he got up and calmly walked out of the office, heading towards the deep forest and high mountains of his country from which he knew he would never return. The monk had told me this as we walked up the mountain to the final place of meditation. I'd cried, tears streaming down my cheeks. But who will teach the townspeople? Who will perform acts of compassion and spread wisdom when you are gone? We have no one else, old father. You're the last." The monk walked in silence for a moment, thinking deeply under the bright light of the sun. "You will, perhaps. We have always passed on wisdom from big hand to small, from old to young. Someone will come, I believe. People who want to obtain the highest wisdom are rare, yet they exist, even in a world so far gone." Strange sounds came from the sides of the trail. It didn't sound like animals, but rather like high-pitched screaming and laughter. I could catch glimpses of black, hateful eyes in the brush, but when I turned to look, they had already gone. "Do you see?" I whispered. The monk nodded slowly, not a trace of fear in his voice. "They are not here for you. They are here for me." "But why?" "They're demons, my son. Their joy comes from death, from pain and loss. And the greatest loss is the loss of enlightenment, of wisdom, of peace. They know this. Their instincts tell them, just like the cheetah knows which of the antelope is slow and hurt before the hunt even begins. They will not trouble you, but if you wish to turn and go, I will not hold it against you. This is my journey, not yours." "I will stay by your side until the end," I said, smiling up at him. He looked sad, but he still stood up straight and proud. Occasionally he would grab at his stomach and bend over, moaning. He would take a few deep breaths, and sweating and wavering slightly, he would return to the trail. But as I looked forward to where the trail ended, my breath caught in my throat. The sky had turned black over the peaks of the mountain. In the blackness, I thought I saw glimpses of eyes and a smile. Will they kill you, old father?" I asked it in my most trembling voice. He walked on in silence for a long time, without answering. We made the top of the mountain. I had never been so high before, and the beauty of the view took my breath away for a moment. I stood there, staring out for hundreds of miles, seeing the rolling hills turned into flat plains and oceans. Towns shone on the land below us, looking dark and tiny, the people like ants. But the blackness of the clouds and the strange demonic noises from the forest ruined much of the beauty for me. Without ceremony, the monk put down his meditation pillow in the middle of a patch of soft grass. He looked down at it, then he looked over at me. "I will not be rising again. You must return home alone after the end." "I will. You've shown me fearlessness. I will be like you. I'm not afraid of death or demons, just like you. I can get home by myself." "Your parents will worry," the monk said, but I shook my head. "This is more important. I'll stay by your side until the end. You will not be alone." "I'm never alone. I walk the path of the Buddha. He is here, by my side, on the trail and above, selfless and free as the wind. I'll follow him out at the end, I hope. We will go together without self." I didn't understand what he said, but I smiled all the same. "Now I must sit and meditate. Time is short. Do what you will, my son. You were always a good boy, standing by my side, by the side of a man who is dying." The lightning and hail began within minutes of him sitting down to meditate. I tried to take refuge under the great canopies of the tree, but the monk got pelted with hail, great balls of ice that smashed and cracked against the ground. I saw some hit him on the head, causing streams of blood to run down his face and soak into his robes. Yet he never reacted, but breathed slowly in and slowly out, concentrating his mind on the final goal. As the storm worsened, lightning began to strike the top of the mountain. The blasts felt like bombs, and the trees split apart under the force of the explosion. But the monk did not react. I moved further into the woods, but not so far that I couldn't see the monk. I stood there, huddled and shaking, wondering why I'd come so far, and yet when I looked at the clear, calm face of the monk, my doubt disappeared. "He's alone, dummy," I chided myself when the terror grew too great. "Would you leave him to die? Stay with him until the end. Let him know that at least one person cares for his life." But the storm didn't end. It grew more intense, and from the darkness of the sky above, I saw many eyes looking down on the monk. They looked upon him with hatred and hunger, as if they wished to eat him alive. From the forest below, I heard many footsteps. There was great laughter, demonic and low. From the trees, I saw abominations emerge on the trail and the paths they walked. I'd gone to the edge of the forest, but I could look down the mountain and still see the old monk. They looked mutated and sick, the demons below. Their skin had great gouges, blisters and cuts, maggots and pus pouring out from each wound. Some walked on 2 legs, others on 4, and they bit and clawed at each other as they walked, some snarling or shrieking, others laughing and chittering like hyenas on the prowl. The old monk, by this point, looked bloodied and hurt. The hail and the chunks of the trees from the lightning had hit his body over and over. From dozens of deep wounds, the blood trickled down his robes. But his head wasn't bowed, and he emanated peace. He's bloodied, but his head is unbowed, I said to myself, thinking. It seemed to have great relevance, but I couldn't understand why. As the demons approached, the lightning began to strike closer and closer to the monk. The ground shook with each blast, and I feared the mountain would fall apart under the strength of the crash. The first row of demons had seen the monk. The bloodlust and loathing had showed from their eyes, and it made me scared. When the wind blew, a smell filled the area, like burning sulfur mixed with the odors of decomposing bodies. I took a step back into the forest, trying to hide myself as best I could. But as they approached, the monk opened his eyes. Light seemed to stream from within him, great waves of it that came from those eyes. And for the first time in his life, he must have experienced the greatest bliss. His eyes widened, and eternity seemed to pour from deep within him. Those eyes never moved, but they seemed to see everything. A small smile forced across his lips. For a moment, I felt like I looked not upon an old man, but a blazing pillar of light. "I have attained peace," he said, pulling a knife out of his robe and putting it to his throat. "Despite my dying and my sickness, I have attained peace. I will not be returning, never, to this world." And with a look of bliss beyond anything I'd ever seen, he slit his own throat and died. At the moment he died, the black clouds and thunder and demons receded, and I found myself standing under a bright summer sky, alone with the corpse of a man who would never return. I recently moved into a new house in a quiet suburban area. I'm not going to say where it is because it's had its fair share of media coverage and teens showing up at night to try to get a glimpse inside the infamous house. It's been on the market for 3 years, and I secured the house at a much cheaper price due to the fact that 2 people had been murdered there. The mystery and the brutality of the murders catapulted the story into the local news. No specific details were released to the public, and I only found out about it because a friend of mine is a local realtor with connections. Nobody was ever arrested for the murders. A male in his 30s was found in the living room, and a female in her 30s was found barricaded in the basement. Another mysterious fact was that the woman had barricaded herself from the inside in a desperate attempt to stop someone or something from getting in. Yesterday, while doing some cleaning in the basement, I came across a cell phone that had fallen down a gap behind the washing machine in the wall. There's a voice recording on it. Recorded the same night as the murders by the female victim. It's pretty terrifying. I've already handed it to the police, but I made a transcript of the recording. What you are about to read is the unedited transcript of the cell phone recording I found in the basement. I have to admit, it's pretty disturbing. The desperation in her voice will haunt me forever. Here goes. "If you're hearing this, please, please, please give it to the police. My husband's dead. It killed him. I'm so sorry, Scott. I can hear it upstairs now, looking for a way in, and it's only a matter of time before it finds one. I've barricaded myself in the basement, and I've got my eye on the door, the one way in and the one way out. You see, it can't move if you're looking at it. It began 12 weeks ago, the night Scott, my childhood sweetheart and husband of 5 years, confessed that he'd had a drunken one-night stand at his bachelor party in Europe. The apparent guilt had consumed him for the past 5 years, and his sudden urge to be truthful was due to the fact that we were due to get married this same year. His words hit me like a freight train, and the urge to vomit washed over me like a tsunami. I stormed out of the house, our house, that we'd bought together 12 years prior. I felt like the world had swallowed me whole, and in a way it had. I was struck with a throbbing chest pain that rapidly spread down my entire right side. The pain intensified, taking my breath away as I stumbled into a tree to steady myself and felt my body about to faint. Then, darkness. The next thing I remember was waking up in a dark and dismal forest, devoid of color. The air was dry and had a distinct, melodious smell, like rotten meat or a decaying carcass. Worst of all was the terrifying feeling that I'd never experienced before, and one that I pray I never feel again. The feeling of absolute hopelessness. The sky was dull and cloudless, and was ripped apart by soundless, furious lightning that illuminated the bleak landscape I found myself in. I felt like I'd been wandering for hours, maybe even days, when I came across a decaying cave. Animal bones brushed beneath my feet as I made my way towards it. As I approached the cave, the putrid smell grew with intensity, which caused me to retch, and I was violently sick, bringing up my stomach bile. The entrance was made of crumbling stone and was completely opaque. I threw a small stone into it and heard it ricochet down the stone steps and off the walls. The silent lightning strobed the area, and I was able to glimpse into the cave and saw a few descending steps. Then 2 reptilian eyes flashed in the darkness. I stumbled backwards, and just as the lightning struck, I was forcefully thrown by something unseen. The lightning flashed continuously, accompanied by a gale-force wind tossing me like a rag doll. My eyes were fixed on the cave, and I was crippled with terror as a pale, gangly hand reached around the crumbling stone. Another flash hurled me hard against a tree, and suddenly I woke up in the back of an ambulance with paramedics hovering over me with a defibrillator, and 2 words that sent a cold, grotesque shiver through my spine. Welcome back. Welcome back? Back from where? What was that place? That thing in the cave? How long was I gone? Hundreds of questions raced through my mind, but none of them was something I had an answer for. Not yet, anyway. You died in the back of that ambulance, the doctor said, as I lay in a bed in the ICU. The room tilted as I tried to digest what the doctor was telling me. I felt like I was in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I'm 30 years old. I eat healthy. I run 4 times a week. How could this be happening to me? My scans revealed I'd inherited a faulty gene and developed hypertrophic cardiomyopathy and suffered a cardiac arrest. I spent the next 7 weeks in the ICU and told nobody of the dark forest or the creature with the yellow eyes. Just the thought of that place was enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. My mother practically moved into the hospital, fussing over me like mothers often do. She blamed herself for my condition, even though her scans were clear, meaning I'd inherited it from my absent father. My husband Scott came on the first day, but I asked him for space. I needed some time to heal and process everything that had happened about both my condition and his infidelity. Although he kept that promise, he would call my mom every day to check on me, to make sure I was okay. I wasn't. Not because of my condition, but from something else. I'd started to see something. I wasn't sure what it was at first. It started out as a tiny dot in my peripheral, nothing more than a speck on my retina. Of course, I had my eyes checked, but All results came back clear, as did the result of my visual cortex. Days later, what started as a dot had began to grow. The first time I saw it, I was at the doctor's office. He left me alone for a moment while he consulted with his surgeon. It was dark outside. The sound of heavy rain pitter-pattering against the glass was hypnotic. I stared at the window, watching as a small handful of people came in and out of the hospital. Then, my eyes were drawn to an ominous silhouette at the far end of the parking lot. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features due to the minimal light, but there was something there, standing deadly still in the shadows. A car horn broke my concentration. A man getting into his truck in the lot and must have pressed the horn by accident. I turned back to the silhouette and was in a completely different position. It had moved. It was standing eerily still again, but like it had frozen mid-walk. I could just make out its elongated limbs, like its arms and its legs had been stretched out. The doctor returned momentarily, startling me. He'd gotten my scans, and everything was how it should be. Good news, you should be okay to be discharged in a few days. That was great news. I was ready to get out of the hospital. I turned back to the window in curiosity, but whatever it was gone. I didn't think about it again until the night before I was going home. It was late, and most of the patients were sleeping. My room is situated at the end of the hall, so I have a clear view of it through my observation window. I wasn't quite ready to go to sleep and was watching something on my iPad. Suddenly, there was a putrid odor wafting in through my open window. The same unmistakable smell that I'd experienced in that other place. 2 nurses walked past my room, neither showing any sign that they could smell it. I covered my nose and mouth and tried to stop myself from heaving. Then my eyes drifted to the observation window and to the corridor. It was here again, the silhouette. At the far end of the hall, completely still with its back pressed up against the wall. But I could see it. It was tall and skinny and had either feelers or tentacles stretched up against the wall like ink spills. Its daunting yellow eyes stared straight at me. I saw another nurse walk up the hall and straight past it, like it wasn't there. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe visual hallucinations were a symptom of what I'd been through. Maybe it was a side effect of the meds I was taking. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. There's nothing there. There's nothing there. It isn't real, I whispered to myself. I opened my eyes and it hadn't gone. It had moved closer. Halfway down the hall, it had dropped onto all fours like a large dog, staring straight at me. Its long tentacles spread out across the floor and up the wall. I was absolutely petrified. I moved over to the window tentatively. The smell that resonated from this creature was overpowering. I watched it for a few moments until a nurse walked past the window and stared at me. Like before, when I looked back, it wasn't there. It was as though I'd imagined it. I climbed back into bed, but I didn't sleep a wink that night. The next morning, my mom came to pick me up. I left with a suitcase of medication and instructions on how and when to take them. I didn't tell my mom or anyone at the hospital about my hallucinations. I was worried if I did, the doctor wouldn't let me leave. I had decided to stay with Mom until I was ready to talk to Scott. He brought a box over with some essentials, some comfy clothes and pajamas, and my own toothbrush, since I'd been using a cheap dollar store one that I had brought up till now. He was sorry, and it was clear that he hadn't been sleeping. He said he'd wait for me until I was ready to talk. I missed both him and our house, but I wasn't ready to talk about it. Not yet. My mom suggested that I go into town, see the locals, get some fresh air in my lungs. She offered to drive me, and then we could meet back up in an hour for lunch. While in town, I noticed a poster for the yearly traveling fairground in a store window. I was fond of it. I had good memories growing up of the fair. It's where Scott and I had shared our first kiss. We were halfway around the Ferris wheel when it started to rain. He covered us with his jacket, and then he kissed me. That was the moment I knew I'd fallen for him. I was flooded with happy emotions, and it felt right that I should text Scott. "I'm ready to talk. I'll be at the place where we shared our first kiss at 8 o'clock tonight. Chloe." He replied almost instantly, "I'll be there. Thank you." After a quick smile to myself, I went to walk to the local market. It was bustling with energy, vendors selling fruits and produce, handmade furniture, bakeries, and plenty of other things. After browsing the stalls, I was hit with that smell again, that horrific, nauseating smell. I felt the hair on my arms prickle up. I knew it was here, somewhere, observing me. My eyes narrowed as I scanned the area. I weaved in and out of the locals, looking for it. Paranoia struck me like lightning. I was bumping into people as I went. All eyes had now turned to me. I burst into tears, sprinting back to the lot and leaping into Mom's car. I was sitting in the passenger seat, crying my eyes out. I looked out the window and saw my mother rushing back to the car, shouting my name. Someone must have told her I'd been freaking out. I looked out the opposite window, and it was there, standing on top of a vehicle several cars away. "Get away from me!" I screamed. My mother whipped open the door. "What is it? What happened?" she replied. She couldn't see it. Nobody could see it. I told her that I'd just had a panic attack. I hadn't been around people outside the hospital in a few months, and I felt overwhelmed. She knew I wasn't being truthful, but it's the only answer I could give. That night, I decided to go ahead and meet Scott at the fair. When I saw him waiting for me by the Ferris wheel, my heart felt whole again, if only for a moment. We took our tokens and went to the wheel. He talked as we went around about how sorry he was and how much of an idiot he'd been, which I agreed with. Everything was going well until I saw that creature again, standing on top of the ghost house attraction, watching me. I kept my eyes on the figure while grabbing Scott's arm. Do you see it?" I asked him in a shaky voice. "See what?" he replied. "It's standing right there on top of the ghost house." I could see him squinting, trying to look, but I knew deep down that he wouldn't be able to see it, because only I could. "Sweetie, there's nobody there. Look at me," he replied calmly. "I can't. If I look away, it'll move." "Chloe, look at me. There's nothing there." He grabbed my chin and turned my face towards his. "No, it'll move. It wants me to look away," I screamed. I quickly spun around, my eyes darting back to the ghost house. But it wasn't there. I looked around, anxious. Scott looking on with worry. "Where is it?" My anxiety was palpable. I looked down, and it was at the bottom of the Ferris wheel. It had moved inhumanly fast. I screamed and almost fell out of the carriage. But Scott held on to me. Hey, I got you. What is it?" he said, desperately trying to keep hold of me. I stood up in a panic, rocking the carriage. Scott tried to hang on to me, but it was too late, and I plummeted 20 feet to the ground. The last thing I remember was Scott screaming for an ambulance. I was fortunate enough to have only suffered a sprained wrist and a slight concussion. My doctor wanted to keep me in overnight, which I reluctantly agreed to. I decided to confide in Scott. I told him everything, that the cave in the forest, the creature, that thing stalking me, this monstrous entity that must have crawled out of the pits of hell. Worst of all, about it getting closer to me. He could see that I was terrified, and instead of trying to explain away what I was experiencing, he just held me. For the first time in a long time, I felt safe. He spent hours just holding me. He offered to stay the night, to stay awake in the chair while I was asleep, but I couldn't have him do that. After Scott left, I managed to get a few hours of rest. I woke up at 2 in the morning and grabbed my bottle of water from the nightstand. That's when I noticed the door was closed, even though I specifically requested that it stay open. And then there was the horrendous smell. I knew it had to be close. It was in the room. It was crouched down in the corner on all fours, blending into the darkness, watching me. I desperately tried to scream, but no sound came out. Keeping my eyes on it, I slowly climbed out of bed, with my back pressed firmly against the wall. I knew it couldn't move if I didn't look away. I sidestepped along the wall towards the door. I started to maneuver around a set of drawers, knocking something off that caught my eye for a millisecond. But that's all it took. It was now standing on its two legs again. It must have been 8 feet tall, with outstretched limbs. A streak of moonlight illuminated part of its pale blue face. Its yellow eyes glistened in the light. Its slimy tentacles spread up the wall and onto the roof. I kept my back to the door and kept moving. I made it to the door, grabbing the door handle, but it was locked. I kicked the door, but no one could hear me. I could see the key for the door on the table in my peripheral. I fumbled around on the table without looking. I grabbed everything but the key. I knew I had to find it. I quickly glanced to my left and saw the key. Looking back, the creature was point blank in front of me, reaching for my throat. Its black curved talons had pierced my neck, and blood was trickling down. Somehow I managed to scream, and within seconds 2 orderlies had barged through the door. All they found was me, alone, with blood trickling down my neck. I barged straight past them and ran as fast as I could out of the hospital. I ended up running all the way home. I banged as loud as I could on the door, forgetting that it was almost 3:30 in the morning. Scott answered the door in his pajamas. A worried look stretched across his face. I told him what was happening at the hospital while he bandaged my neck. "See, this is proof that it's something real. This is physical proof. You believe me, right? You have to," I barked. After a pause, he replied, "I believe you. I believe you're seeing something." I registered the pause and the hesitation in his voice. He didn't believe me, but I didn't blame him. After talking for a few hours, I had calmed down enough that I told Scott to get some sleep. He was reluctant to leave me, so he took a nap in the chair. I grabbed my laptop and searched the web for anything related to what was happening. There's thousands of incidents across the world related to haunted houses, demons, cults, possessions, but none that was specific to the entity that was stalking me. Every time I heard a sound, a car outside or a floorboard creak, I jumped. I was a nervous wreck. I went into the kitchen and got a glass of water. I looked out the window into the darkness, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. I went back into the room, and it was there. I dropped my glass, and it shattered on the floor. Scott leapt from the chair. What is it?" I couldn't speak. My lips were glued shut. I slowly raised my hand and pointed at it. It was standing at the far end of the room. I kept my eyes on it the entire time. Scott rushed over to me. "Chloe, there's nothing there, sweetheart. Whatever you're seeing, it isn't real." He headed towards it. "No, Scott, don't!" I pleaded as I grabbed his arm. He shrugged it off and marched over to it. "There's nothing here. I'm going to prove it to you." He cocked his arm back and swung his fist. Only his arm stopped mid-swing. He hit the creature. I moved to grab Scott and stood barefoot on the broken shards of glass, cutting my feet. I screamed out, and for a split second, I looked down. That was all it took. When I looked up, the creature had already grabbed Scott and folded him in half like a piece of paper. The sound of his spine breaking echoed through the house. Scott lay dead on the floor, his eyes wide open and looking at me. I screamed and backed away into the kitchen. I slammed the door shut and ran to the rear door. It was locked, and I'd left the key in my bag in the front room. I noticed Scott's cell phone on the countertop, so I grabbed it and ran down into the basement. I shut the door and pushed the spare fridge in front of it. Then I hid in the corner, crouched down beside the washing machine. That's where I am now, hiding and crying. I can't tell anyone because Scott's cell doesn't have signal down here, which is why I'm recording this message on his cell in the hopes that someone will hear the story. I can hear it now, moving around upstairs, and it knows my eyes will be watching the door, so it's looking for another way in. I'm so scared. I'm the reason Scott's dead. My true love. I'll never forgive myself for that. The thought of that is far worse than anything the monster can do to me. Oh God, it's here. The old laundry chute. How did I forget? What am I going to do? It's watching me with those horrifying yellow eyes. I can't keep running because it'll find me. And I won't put anyone else in danger. It's me that it wants. I'm so sorry, Scott. I love you so much. Mom, I love you too. I'm gonna close my eyes now. 3, 2, 1. That's it. That's the recording. It's very disturbing to me. If only you could hear her voice. She was terrified. The police haven't been in contact as I write this. I'm not expecting them to either. The woman mentioned her mother in the recording. I might try to find her, tell her what I found, just in case the police don't believe me. I guess I need to write this down, just in case I'm right and I'm dead tonight. My name's Tom. I'm 14 years old, and I did something horrible. I killed someone. Well, I mean, it was an accident. It wasn't just me, but I caused someone's death, or helped to do it. Now he's coming after me. I know that sounds crazy, but it's true. And I need to get all of this stuff off my chest before it's too late. My 2 best friends are dead. Braden died last Wednesday, and Bart died last Wednesday before that. They were bullies, and I guess I am too. But they were my friends, and I miss them. Bart was kind of the leader, I guess you could say. He was this big, tough kid, and he loved picking on people. I used to think it was funny. That's wrong of me, I know, but you sort of sometimes get, excited that someone isn't picking on you, so you join in when they're picking on someone else. The kid's name was Max, and he was Bart's favorite target. He was this little guy, skinny and short, with big buck teeth and shaggy hair. He wore glasses, and his family doesn't have a lot of money, so his clothes were always too big because they came from his older brother. Hand-me-downs, you know. Max has an older sister, too, this weird girl about to go to college. She always dresses in black clothes and stuff, and everyone makes fun of her and calls her a witch or things like that. She's a total loon. My parents didn't like when I started hanging out with Braden and Bart. Braden was an alright guy, I guess, but he was kind of like me, caught up in Bart's crap and just thankful not to be on the receiving end of everything. Bart beat a lot of kids up. We were just glad not to be getting our asses kicked, I guess. It's not like Bart didn't have good qualities. He was a funny guy, and he could be nice sometimes. His dad is a big jerk, and he had a bad home life. I guess the bullying makes sense when you filter it through that. I'm sure most bullies are kind of like fighting through something when it comes down to it. I mean, no one's just mean for the sake of being mean, are they? Okay, so Bart and Braden and I, we like to play football in Braden's backyard a lot. He's got a big backyard, but at the end it was this little creek, and we'd all taken some spills in there before, running down the line trying to evade tackles or whatever. Bart had the idea that we should invite Max over to play with us. He asked him on a Wednesday after school and was super nice to him, apologized for being so crappy to him, and asked him to come over to play. I was there. Max lit up like a Christmas tree. He seemed so excited to be invited. We laughed about it as we walked to Braden's. Max wasn't with us. He said he had to go home and ask his mom first. We waited for the kid in Braden's front yard, and Bart hit my shoulder when he saw him riding his bike down the street to us. We were all super nice. I don't know, I guess He knew we were being crappy, but we kept catching each other's eye and smirking. We went into the backyard and started tossing the football around. Max was better than any of us thought he was going to be. He didn't seem like the kind of kid who would be good at sports, but he caught everything and had a decent arm on him. He asked if we were going to play a game, and Bart told him that we were. He asked Max if he had ever heard of the game Smeer the... Well, I don't want to say it. My sister's gay, and I love her and support her. I was uncomfortable with the word anytime Bart said it, and he said it a lot. I mean, he said the Q word in a crappy way, like to make fun of people. I'm sure you've heard of the game, he suggested. Max said he'd never heard of it. Bart explained that whoever had the ball was the Q word, and everyone else tackled him. Then he tossed Max the ball. He caught it, and we rushed him, knocking him to the ground. Bart did, at least. Braden, too. I guess I did, as well. Every time Max got up, one of us would knock him down again. Eventually he tossed the ball away, but we didn't stop. We just kept tackling him. Max was crying. He got a split lip. He was bleeding pretty bad, and I turned to the others and told him to stop, but Bart got so pissed that he knocked me down. He told me that if I don't want to play anymore, I could go be the Q word, and he would smear me. So I played. I knocked Max down, over and over and over again. Max tried to run. He ran towards the back of our yard, and we chased him. Bart was the fastest, and he slammed into Max, and the kid went flying into the creek. We stood at the bank, and I'll never forget the sight. Max was dead, lying with his head on a rock, his blood leaking into the slow-moving water. That was about a month ago, and I know I'll never get the sight out of my mind as long as I live. Which won't be that long, I guess. Maybe that's what I deserve. The rest of the day is kind of a blur. Braden's mom was at work, so we called the police. We told them it was an accident, that we had just been playing and Max had slipped, and we had to go down to the station for hours and talk, each of us with our parents and a cop. They asked about the split lip and some bruises, and we all just said that's what happens sometimes when you play football. They bought it. We all went to the funeral. Braden and I were pretty shaken up, and we stopped talking to Bart. I could tell he was shaken up too, but he kept making jokes about it. He wouldn't laugh or anything. I think he was trying to make himself feel better. Like, had it been an accident. Max's sister came up to Bart at the funeral and yelled at him. She was crying, and it was hard to watch. She said she knew something had happened. Her parents had to drag her away from Bart. She told Bart that she would bring her brother back and that he would set things right. We all thought she was crazy. 2 Wednesdays ago, I was asleep when the phone rang. It was like 2 a.m, and I answered. It was Bart. He told me Max was in his yard. I told him that was impossible, but he sent me a picture, and it sure looked like Max, right outside his window. He was just standing there, wearing the suit that he was buried in. His face was all gray and gaunt. Bart was scared. He said he was going to hide. He was home alone for the night. His parents had gone out, and they went out a lot. He said he was hiding in the closet. He begged me to come over, begged me to save him, and then he started screaming. The call ended, and I called him back over and over, but he didn't answer. I almost went over there, but I was frozen in fear in my bed. I couldn't convince myself to get out from under the covers. The next morning at school, everyone learned that Bart was dead. His parents had found him earlier that morning. He was dead in his closet. I told Braden everything and showed him the picture Bart had sent me. He was terrified. Last Wednesday was our last day of school before summer. Braden came up to me near the end of the day and told me they'd been outside for gym class, and he'd seen Max standing across a soccer field, just by the trees there. When Braden had pointed him out to someone else, Max was gone. Behind a tree, maybe. Braden was scared that Max was coming for him next. The next day, Braden was dead too. His mom found him outside in their backyard. Some kids said his head had been turned around, but I don't know if that's true or not. I wonder if Max's sister really brought him back. She must have. Maybe she really is a witch. Today I woke up and looked out my window, and I could see someone standing down the road, just in the center of the street. Small, in a suit. It's Max. I went outside, but he was gone. But I know it was him. I know why he killed Bart first. He knows Bart was the ringleader. Maybe he saved me for last because I tried to stop the others. I don't know. Maybe he won't kill me. But I keep seeing him. He's getting closer. He was at the end of the street earlier. Then when my dad sent me outside to get the garbage cans from the road, he was closer, in a neighbor's yard, staring at me from around the corner of their house. He's getting closer. He's coming for me. I guess I don't really blame him. I don't know where to start this. It's hard to really put it into words just how shocking this event has come off to me. I guess the best place to start would be to explain what happened. When I was around 10, I had a loving dog named Jocko. He was a husky, and we would go for walks almost every day. One day, however, his rope snapped. He must have seen a squirrel or another small animal and ran off into the woods to chase it. I remember running home in hysterics and explaining what had happened to Dad. He yelled at me, but eventually he went out to his truck and went to go find him. He was gone for about 5 hours, and when he came back, I could tell from his red face and his angered expression that he hadn't found Jocko. Even though I could tell he wasn't coming home, I attempted to ask him if he found my loving dog. "Dad, did you find Jack?" I was immediately slapped in the face and sent off to my room to bed. I was crying into my pillow all night. Jocko was an amazing dog. I'd never loved something more until the night he ran off. I remember his bright red collar with a brass pendant labeled J.O. It had a little dog paw print above his initials. Fast forward to now, I'm 55 years old and I've been working as a dentist for the last 21 years. I was going outside to collect the mail when I heard the sound of barking and twigs snapping. That was when I remembered Jocko. God, it had been so long since I thought of him. My heart was aching as I went inside and read through my mail. I spoke to myself as I went through all of it. Bill, more bills. Finally, the last envelope revealed itself. The paper was trimmed yellow, clearly signifying how old it was. It had an old red wax stamp that had been burdened with time. It was slightly chipped. I read the date on the envelope, 1978. I was confused. I decided to open it and was amazed to find a letter from my grandpa. Grandpa had died long ago when I was about 17. When I read the letter, each sentence made me feel more like crying than the last. "Hey, Felix, I'm really sorry about Jocko. He was a good boy. I'm sure he'll come back to you someday. He's probably out there chasing squirrels. I hope this letter reaches you and doesn't get stuck in processing or any of that. Sincerely, Grandpa." The last sentence broke the somber mood as I chuckled to myself. The irony of the situation, lightening my day as I started to get ready for work. I checked my phone, 6:34 a.m. I had work in about half an hour, so I went to get some coffee ready while I went to the bedroom. As I walked into my room, I was greeted with a sight that made me feel at home. My bedroom reminded me of my childhood. The ugly old wallpaper, the yellow-stained tiles, the amazing smell of mustiness, greeting me like a warm embrace. I was happy here. As I was getting ready, I heard more barking. I recognized it. I couldn't pinpoint how exactly, but something about it was familiar. As I finally walked out of my bedroom, I stopped in my tracks. I realized what it was and recognized the sound. It was Jocko. It was the same high-pitched, mellow bark that I recognized from my childhood. I immediately rushed out my door. I ran to the back of the house. I frantically rounded the corner to see my childhood best friend lying in the dirt. Immediately, two details popped into my head, which made me happy and confused. I had moved around 700 miles away from my childhood home. And two was, when Jocko ran off, he was around 5 years old. Dogs don't live that long, I thought. Maybe this was a different dog that sounded and looked like Jocko. That thought was immediately disproven as I noticed the bright red collar and the brass pendant around his neck. I ran up to him and he didn't even seem fazed. He started to groan as I looked at the pendant. The initials read J.O. My hands were shaking so violently, it looked like I was having a seizure. I immediately embraced my long-lost best friend, but something felt wrong. He was way too cold, even for the early morning weather. I sort of flinched, but I didn't care. I hugged him so tightly, I felt my body ache. Finally, I got up and let him inside. He moved weirdly, almost like he was drunk. I chalked it up to his extreme old age, but I noticed how the collar seemed pristine. I immediately called into work and explained how I wasn't going to make it because I wasn't feeling good. As I stood there on the phone, I noticed how my dog kept on bumping into things. Again, I thought it was old age. I couldn't believe I'd found Jocko after all these years anyway. The sleepless nights I had endured over his disappearance. I couldn't help but tear up as I hugged him again. That's when I noticed. Jocko's eyes had turned a brown color. I very vividly remembered him having sapphire blue eyes. In fact, it was such a prominent feature that we nicknamed him Bluey at the time. I was shocked. I didn't know how to react. My emotions were a mixture of curiosity, confusion, and fear. I sort of just stared at him as I analyzed his face. Everything about it seemed crooked. It was like he had slowly morphed. I noticed patches of dark fur I hadn't seen before. His snout seemed more jagged, but the biggest detail was his teeth. They seemed way too sharp and narrow for a dog. I hadn't even seen that in wolves. I sort of pondered as I went to get him food and water. Everything raced through my mind at once. Thoughts like, that's not your dog, or how did he get here? I was so confused, I felt almost dazed as I brought the dish of foul-smelling dog food and tap water to Jocko. I sat it down and watched as his previously sloppy demeanor changed into a fast, focused strut. He elegantly waltzed over to his meal and proceeded to devour it within seconds. "Must be hungry, huh, Jock?" I said sarcastically. That joking mood changed into something serious as he glanced from his food and stared right at me. He was looking into my eyes as I glanced at him. As odd as it sounds, his eyes seemed human. I can't properly put it into words. I looked at him, but right as I was about to look away, he groaned at me. Now, I swear to you guys, I heard the word help come from that groan. It was like a whisper traveling into the room. I immediately felt sick as I backed away. I don't understand why I decided to do what I did next, but some people make mistakes in a moment of quick thought. I decided to keep Jocko with me. I thought, all of this is just stress. None of this is serious. You probably just heard something. I really had no clue what was about to happen, though. Because I didn't have work that afternoon, I decided that finishing up my basement would be a great idea. I'd been working on this thing for 5 months, and it was a perfect man cave. Hardwood floors, a massive TV, felt like a perfect hangout place for someone like me. I even had a vintage Atari sitting there to relive my childhood passions. As I slowly crept down the steps, each creak and groan and crack making me feel nervous. I was still quite shaken up from Jocko's sudden appearance, and I had to think for a good minute about what to do. You obviously can't just take in an enormous husky after years and years of not owning a dog. I started to remember how long it had been since I'd seen him last. 1978? That was simply not possible. It was 2023, and that meant that Jocko would be 50 years old. I started to think, what if this was a completely different dog I just brought in? What if he's completely rabid? I started to worry as I shifted damp cardboard boxes in the basement. Each shift made me flinch as I heard the familiar sound of paws stomping on hardwood. I listened as Jocko slowly walked down the wooden stairs. I turned around to see him. His tongue was hanging out. I saw black viscous liquid on his tongue, and I almost gagged. The room was filled up with a pungent odor. Think of roadkill that's been left to rot in the sun. I started to gag even harder as I watched Jocko take very slow steps towards me. It reminded me of a wolf silently approaching its prey. Then I saw the collar, and all previous thoughts of this being a different dog were wiped away. In awe, I watched as he drove me into a corner. Jocko, calm down, boy. It's me. It's Felix. I watched as he perked his head to the side. His ears twitched. That's a good boy. Every word I spoke felt like a challenge. It was actually hard to think. I was so worried about him going crazy, I didn't even notice the silence. There were no more birds fluttering or calling. No more insects or bees. Hell, not even the wind was swaying. It felt hopeless. I didn't know why I dismissed the smell or the black liquid that was on my once beloved dog's tongue. I was just worried about being bitten. I stretched my hand after a bout of thought and began to slowly stroke him. Even though he was clearly old and he'd been outside for decades, his fur still felt the same. It was incredibly smooth. It felt like silk was caressing my hands. I watched as he began to calm down. I finally walked past him and led him up the stairs. I was contemplating calling a vet. After a few minutes of thinking, I decided that it was for the best. Hell, what if Jocko had rabies and he bit me? I shook the thought off and rang up our local vet. After a few minutes of discussing, we decided on an appointment for tomorrow. I sighed. Even a day with Jocko felt like torture. I was actually surprised. After so many years of missing and begging for my dog to come back, I was now contemplating making him go away. Eventually, it fell dark, and the feeling of tiredness swiftly overtook me. I got ready for bed and decided to check up on Jocko before I went to sleep. As I quietly tiptoed down the stairs, each step making me feel more on edge, that was when I heard a very distinct sound. It was like something wet slapping a hard surface. I could hear the echoes. It was coming from the basement. I felt a sense of dread deep in my stomach as I slowly rummaged to find the door to my basement. I noticed something. The door was wide open. I very slowly began to make my way down the stairs. Every hair on my body started to stand up as I made it to the halfway point. It was cold. I felt my body begin to shake violently as the sound got louder and louder. It was reducing my mind to rubble as I finally made it down. What stood in the corner of my basement was something that would haunt me, even as I lost my memories. Jocko stood there silently on his hind legs. He had something in his mouth. The moon illuminated him through the basement window, and it revealed the blood dripping from his teeth. Finally, I realized what it was. It was the collar of my dog. It had been ripped off of him and still had clumps of fur and parts of it on his neck. It had blood staining it. I immediately looked at this thing's neck and came to a horrible realization. That same collar was on its neck. This was not my dog that stood before me. I let out a yelp, and suddenly there was silence. My mind felt frozen as this thing turned around to see me. Its face was so horribly mangled I could see little bits of mange littering its face like spots of paint. Its Its eyes were black. I could see my own reflection in them, like a mirror. Then I watched as it dropped the collar, and now presumably my dead dog, as it slowly approached me. It walked like a human. I finally found the courage to get away as I ran. As I made it up the stairs and out the door, that thing chased after me. It slammed into my glass sliding door, making it shatter. It let out a horrible yelp. It stood between me and the only place I could now use as an escape. I did the only thing I could think to do. I ran up the stairs and went into my room. I slammed the door shut and locked it as I began to barricade myself with loose furniture. I ran over to my phone and dialed 911. The feeling of hopelessness and sorrow only slightly fading away as the feeling of another person speaking to me came on the line. 911, what's your emergency? Listen, my dog's gone crazy. I'm in my room right now trying to keep it away. It's somewhere in my house. I don't know where. Please just send help. I heard the sound of shuffling on the other end of the line. All right, sir. Make sure to stay on the line and keep out of sight, okay? Everything's going to be okay. What's your address? The sound of horrible screaming and rummaging began to litter the air like a pathogen as I continued. 178 Mangrove Drive. Please send help. I don't know how much longer I can bear this. That's when I looked out the window. I saw the face of my dog looking at me. I lost my breath almost immediately. Its face began to warp into a human. Its skin was white. It smiled at me. How was it this tall? Oh God, my dog's looking at me. It wants to kill me. Please send help. Oh my God. I told these things to the operator as I stared back at the thing. It put its unnaturally slender hand up to its mouth and made a shushing gesture. I screamed, but it didn't last long as I felt the elevating sounds of this thing's horrible chuckle. I felt so alone. It kept on looking at me with its horrible grin, its smile so large as it stretched beyond my window. Then it showed me something that has me crying while I write this. I watched in terror as its hands reached down and pulled something off the ground. It began to pull up a gray fur-covered body. It was Jocko. I could see the red collar on its decapitated body. I began to cry maniacally. Why was this happening? Was this all a dream? Sir, we're 2 minutes away. Hang in there. The voice on the line echoed as a feeling of hope began to fill my body. Something that quickly faded as the thing began to put its hand to my window. I watched as it began to feel around before finally pulling it open. The squeal of the window finally reached the top, and I began to sob. I was ready to accept death. It took the body of my mangled dog and threw it into the room. It landed at my feet, blood pooling the carpet, making it look like red wine had spilled everywhere. I began to embrace my long-gone friend in my lap as I watched the thing smile at me. I heard it stomp as it began to walk away. I didn't care for my life anymore. I sat there crying and hugging my dead best friend. Jocko, no, I quietly uttered as I held him in my lap. I heard the fading sounds of sirens began to approach as I sat there with my dog. The rest of it's a blur. I woke up in the hospital. I don't know how, but I'd cuts littered all over my body. I thought it was from me hurrying to barricade my door, or the glass from the initial impact of that thing slamming into my sliding door. It's been 2 days now. I'm still in the hospital. I don't know what's happening. My house is being investigated. I might be sent to jail under suspicion of animal abuse and neglect, but I'm not so sure. I love you, Jocko. I wish you'd never ran away.